everybody have an outline for the night? Passed out? Take one now. You passed them out. Anyone else? Outline for the night? All right. Huh? Do we have a teacher? Yeah, I hope so. All right, so one of the things we're doing, and there's kind of a little bit of a tentative schedule on this. We are going to be talking about discipleship for the next 13, 14 weeks, because we do get an extra one. And we are going to have a couple combined classes. As you see, our teens are in here tonight, so we're going to be doing some combined and also some separate, but me and Israel are working together. And one of the things we would like to see come out of this is a greater emphasis on discipleship, mentorship, older help, working with the younger, but also the younger discipling each other, right? Teens discipling each other. So I really kind of want to start off with this question tonight, but who discipled you? Who discipled you? Where's my... Anyone want to go? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I was going to say this young, real young, nice-looking lady who worked in a Western auto store that I would occasionally visit. She's sitting right next to me now. I was kind of a difficult person to disciple because I just thought, again, hey, I believe in God. What's the deal?
So what did that process look like?
Well, she invited me to worship.
Okay.
She invited me to the house. I had quite a few meals with them. We had dates. We had a lot of long discussions at night because I was a real hard head.
You fall asleep on the phone together?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry, what? I almost be able to hear. No, we had long discussions sitting in a car just by our house. Yeah, that too. That was in daylight. The other one was in the dark.
Okay.
We'd been on a date, and we didn't go back in. But anyway, yeah, so it took quite some time. I would say 2 or 3 months probably before I ever saw the light. Basically got it.
Okay. So
yeah.
She's the one who brought you to Christ?
Right.
Okay. Anyone else? Bob? No wrong answers tonight. Well,
1965, I was working at the post office. Some of you may remember a preacher named Garland Elkins. He was one of my customers. And he knew I lived in an apartment next to one of his students. And he asked me if I could talk to his student. So I said, sure. So the student come over to our apartment and asked me and my wife if we wanted to do a Bible study. And she was raised Methodist, and I wasn't raised at all, so I was lowered. I wasn't raised. And so, in any case, we agreed, and I can't remember the name of the things, but I think it was something Miles. I don't know if you remember them, but they were a series of videos that you watched, and he
Jewel
did
Films. Jewel Miller?
Jewel Miller. I was close. I mean, about 40, 50, 60 years ago. In any case, after
He chiseled it on a...
He hammered it into us very carefully and gently, and my wife was more receptive than I was. But then I figured, I'll go along with it, see what it is, and I was really impressed with it, and next thing I know, we're being baptized and becoming members of the Church of Christ.
Okay. Anyone else? Your mother? Yeah? Yeah. So a mother with very incentivized devices, shot collar, choker box, those kind of things? All right.
I think it was my parents and really the congregation that I attended, I grew up in, because at that time, people did things together, were together a lot, and there were no TVs and things like that spent a lot of time on. But I remember my parents, especially my dad, watching him and the things that he did that now really impressed me, I didn't realize.
Watching him?
No, my dad.
Oh. Oh,
Yeah.
you watching your dad. I
I
was gonna say, I would have
watched my
watched him
dad.
too.
Yeah, I watched my dad. But I think
Watching.
parents and the church has a lot of influence with young people.
Anyone else? Anyone else have anything different? Maybe someone other than a significant other, someone trying to, not only bring you to Christ, but bring you to the wedding bells? Parents, congregation, preachers?
Best friend.
Best friend? Okay. A good friend then, right? So my point in just kind of throwing that out there right now, first is, one, so far, discipleship has been who's brought you in, right? And we're going to look at part 2 of that throughout this series of who kept you in, right? Who are the influences that after maybe one person brought you in, but maybe it was another reason of why you stayed, right? And so who kind of took notice of you, kind of mentor type kind of thing. But also, we need to understand that not everybody comes to the church the same way, right? And so, you may think because they're not family, right, or they're not members of the congregation, that you may not have influence over them. But if you're a friend, I know a lot of people were brought in from just a neighbor, right? A lot of times there's a neighbor who, hey, we're going to church, do you want to come with us? Right? And so neighbors who are caring and inviting, right? And so there's a sphere of influence that sometimes we don't realize we have, that where Jesus is calling us to disciple. Does everyone in here have a family? Everyone in here have friends? Everyone in here have neighbors? Right? So the responsibility is on all of us. And so let's go to the introduction here. Let's look at the purpose of this study. So the overall purpose for me, when I was coming up with this, is to enjoy a deeper relationship as a disciple to the King, okay? So King Jesus, obviously, is the one who is the head of the church, and through the process of discipleship, you grow closer to Jesus. That's the first goal. First goal has to be drawing closer to God. Okay? And a lot of times we think drawing closer to God, we just think of prayer, maybe Bible study, meditation. But what we're going to see is Jesus is going to invite people, especially his disciples. The way in which he invites them into a deeper relationship with him is not just, hey, pray to me. Not just read stories about me, right? But spend time with me, serve with me, work with me, put your hands to the work. Okay? And later in the scriptures, Paul will talk about Timothy encouraging him when he left him in Ephesus. He says, hey, I know you're suffering, but we get to share in the sufferings of Christ. And so even suffering together with Jesus is a part of the discipleship process, which ultimately will bring us closer to Jesus. First, we got to learn how to be a disciple of King Jesus, because what we've heard tonight, and they're not bad answers, but we've really only talked about who told me about Jesus, who taught me about Jesus, or who brought me into Jesus, right? But what about the Jesus model of discipleship, where he took 12 disciples and for 3.5 years spent time with them and trained them, took them along with him, right, while he was doing the work, and he brought them alongside. They got to see it in action. It wasn't just a theological, God's real, Jesus is real, here's how you become a Christian, right? That's step 1 to discipleship. But discipleship must continue, right? And I would even ask, who's discipling you now? And that's why I'm asking in that way. But what is it? We're going to learn how to be a disciple of Jesus. We're also, we're going to learn how to disciple others. We're going to look at the process of discipling other people. And what we want to do is create a natural discipleship process where our teens have at least one contact who is checking in on their spiritual well-being. That's why they are here tonight. They didn't know that. But what I want us to do is bring an awareness bring an awareness to the young people that we have in our congregation who need more people than just their parents. I'll be honest with you, and nothing against my mom and dad, but if it was just the faith of my mom and dad, it would not have been enough. My grandmother was involved. I had a youth worker involved. I had preachers involved. I had friends involved, right? The one contact was not enough for me. I needed more. And right, there's even a stat out there when someone's brought into a congregation. Does anyone know how many points of contact they need? How many friends they need for it to stick? It's about 7. And those vary. 7 for one person. Don? Wait, let's get a mic.
Another point of emphasis should be new converts, because a lot of times our youth have family here, and a lot of us that have been here, we've already established those close relationships.
Yep.
But for new converts, it is so important. A lot of times they just have the person who studied with them, but it's so important to branch out and have a lot of other contacts and close relationships in the congregation.
Yeah, and that's hard to do if you don't have a model of discipleship already going on in the church.
It has to really be intentional.
That's the thing. Not discipleship, and that's going to be, and that's in the notes. Discipleship does not happen on accident. There's no such thing as an accidental Christian, right? You weren't born into Christianity, right? You're not accidentally become a Christian. It's intentional. Somebody took the time to intentionally see, you know what? Jesse is worth my time of teaching the gospel, right? And then after I became a Christian, there were people who intentionally kept me in, kept me accountable, helped disciple me. And I'll be honest with you, even with all this years of influence I had, I really still didn't have the Jesus model of discipleship. That's why a lot of us struggle with discipling, because we weren't really discipled ourselves. We were converted, but we were not discipled. And being converted and being discipled are two different things. Don, go ahead.
A lot of people think that they are not able to study with someone. They don't feel comfortable doing the initial study, but all of us can get involved in somebody's life once they come into the church.
What does 1 Corinthians 3 tell us about the different works? Some water, some plant. Right? And those are just 2 aspects. There's more than that. Right? Sometimes all me and Don need, or the people who can study with somebody, is just the contact. You have contacts. You have spheres of influence that I cannot be in all of your spheres of influence. It's impossible for me. Right? It's impossible for 1 or 2 people. So this is a group effort. Now, what we're going to really be honing in on here is when not necessarily creating new disciples, which that's a whole class in itself. I only have 13 weeks. It's going to be discipling those who are already here. That's going to be the focus of these 13 weeks. Because I think if we can do that, when people are discipled correctly, guess what they're naturally going to do? They're naturally going to look and seek for disciples themselves. And that's going to be hopefully the outgrowth of this. I don't expect magic things to happen in 13 weeks, okay? I don't expect us to change the entire way we do things, but we are going to bring an awareness, okay? So I want to ask by show of hands, who knows how many kids we have that are 7th grade all the way up to college? Does anyone have an idea of how many teens and college age kids we have in this congregation? 40. Okay, 40? 18? Whether they come or not, the numbers of people who should be here or not here, whatever, but the numbers on our list. So we had 17, 40, what'd you say? 18? 25, 50? So we have 17 just from 7th to 12th grade kids. Now, as you see, we have our 7th to 12th grade kids here. Do you see 17 of them? So where are they? College age, we have 14. Do you see 14 college age students here? Now, a lot of them are in college or at college, right? And my point is not to guilt shame those who are not here. My point is to bring an awareness that there are many kids, there are many teens, there are many young college age students who don't have the 7 connections. If they did, they'd be here. That's almost a proven stat, almost 100%. If someone has 7 true connections in a congregation, they're 100% guaranteed to come. So, what are we to do about it? Right? And I've got a list. If anyone wants to know the list, I was going to write everyone's name up, but I'm not going to do that. But my point is to bring awareness, okay? So we talked about who discipled you. Now, have you duplicated the process by which you were discipled to others? Who would you say you have discipled in your life? Now, I'm not asking anyone to raise their hand necessarily right for this question. I just want you to think, who would you say you've discipled? Right? If you have kids, right? We've got kids who we should be discipling. Neighbors, cousins, kids in this congregation. Who do you think you've taken a special interest in mentored? Mentor may be a better word in that sense because we think more in mentorship, right? In apprenticeship than we do discipleship, but it's the same concept. Kelly, do we have a mic? Oh.
I just want to go back to your previous point just a second. I hope it doesn't throw you off right there. But when you were talking about the college kids, we had 13 of those kids at our house Saturday night. They love being around each other. They are great examples to each other because they know what each other's going through in this stage of life. And I just think that our college ministry is a great thing that's going on here at our congregation.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important that we do invest. And the reason why this is important, one, Jesus commands it. Right? Obviously, we always go back to Jesus commands it. Jesus did it, and we were trying to imitate Jesus. But practically speaking, why are most churches dying? They don't have the next generation. How many of you have traveled to a church where there's nobody who's under 60 in the whole congregation? Or if there is, there's very few. There may be a grandbaby, there may be a whatever. And it's more than just one time. I've traveled places, I've preached at places here on some summer series, and I'm kind of going, where are the kids? Where are the teens? They're like, we've got all of our teens here, and there's 2, right? And, sometimes teen groups grow and change based upon family numbers. But man, 60 plus, the church that I worked with previously, the average age was 67 years old until me and my family moved in. And we brought it down a couple years. 67 years old as the average age. So there is something that is happening. And I'm not here to figure out what the blame is, but there's something happening to the next generations that the faith is not being passed on the way in which it's effective. People may say, well, I tried teaching my kids. Well, how did you try? How did you try discipling them? What was your process? Well, I didn't really have a process. I just there's a process. There's a biblical process. In that when we follow that process, it leads to growth. God gives the increase when we follow the process. Now, will that save absolutely everybody? Didn't then, it won't now. Right? But we cannot fail at the process and then wonder, what happened to my kids? What happened to the next generation? And unfortunately, a lot of times we start discipling way too late, don't we? When do we start discipling? Oh, I've noticed so-and-so hasn't been here. Maybe now I should care. Maybe now I should get involved. Maybe now where were you for the last 5 years in their life? The last 7 years in their life, right? Intentional Christianity, intentional discipleship, and hopefully it becomes natural. One of the cool things about this church, and once again, this is not a beat up on the Lenore City Church of Christ, this is just a study on discipleship. One of the cool things, especially with my kids, and I can only tell you about my kids, half the time my kids here, they don't even sit with me because they've got so many other people they can sit with. Whether it be friends or other parents or other. The discipleship process is happening not just at home, but here and everywhere they go. But we work on those who we want in our kids' lives are those who are trying to point them to who? Point them to heaven, right? Point them to God. And so that's the people we need to be putting in our kids' life. And if we have all of their major influences in their life are people who are non-church people, what are the chances if they have more influences in the world than in the church? What are the chances of them staying? And unfortunately, we wait too long. They're gone, and then we try to get them back. That's passive and that's defensive. And we should not be passive and defensive in parenting and discipleship. Okay? So that's the goal. The goal is just bring awareness to both our teens as well, because hopefully in the next couple weeks, you're going to have some strange older people. I'm old. I'm 34, right? I'm one of the older people. Just throwing it out there. Coming up and saying, how was your week? How can I pray for you? What's going on? And be ready to share in your spiritual journey. But you want to know what's going to help them share? What are they going to need to hear from you? What's going on with you? How's your spiritual walk? How's your spiritual journey? Tell them stories, right? Explain to them about your life and your journey. We need to provide those opportunities. Okay, so that's enough of what to expect in this class, what the process is, what we're going to go down, go to the discussion. What does a disciple look like? The word disciple is used 261 times in the New Testament. You think that's important? 261 times. Guess where every single occurrence is found? 2 groups of books. The Gospels, which is 95% of the time, and the book of Acts. Why is that significant? What's significant about disciple in the Gospels and the book of Acts? I'm sorry, what? Acts of the Apostles. Okay.
Because that's when the church was supposed to be
Yep, the book of Acts, when the church is first being founded, right? So you're making new disciples. Bob?
The word act itself means something that you do. You act on what you learn.
Yeah, a lot of times we call it the actions of the apostles, right? Anyone else?
Those books tell the story of Jesus.
So the way I describe the book of the Gospels and Acts, the Gospels is Jesus' earthly ministry while he was here. The book of Acts is Jesus' heavenly ministry through the church. And what was Jesus' mission when he was here? Seek and save and make disciples. 90% of those 261 times, the word disciple is connected with Jesus and his disciples. All right? So we need to put an emphasis on what that term means. Somebody read Matthew chapter 4, verse 19. Matthew 4, 19. Please use a mic if you're going to read. Teens, feel free to read as well. Volunteer.
Matthew 4:19, and he said unto them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.
So when he says follow, what is he doing? He's inviting them, isn't he? Right, he's talking to disciples, so he's inviting. And I will make you. right? I will make you, which means he is the one who is doing what? Who is transforming and shaping and discipling them. What does he say? Read that again. Matthew 4:19. And I will make you what?
I'll make you fishers of men.
The process of discipleship is found right here. Invite, transform, and send. Invite, transform, send. Follow, I will make, and I will send. Right? Think about that. Where do we normally end that process? Sometimes it's just the invite. We invite them to church. We invite them to worship. We invite them to Bible class. And everybody was super friendly to them. But what happens when they walk out that door? How often does someone who's invited come back for a second or third time? I would say we have a higher statistic here in this church than most churches do. One, because they are getting, how many hands or hugs do you have to get before you can get out that door? Right? It's like, you start walking by me, I was like, get over here. Don will hunt you down in the parking lot. I mean, he'll hunt you down. Kelly's going to be giving you a bag, right, if you're invited here. All these points of contact increase the likelihood of them returning. Okay, someone's inviting, but who's making? Who's making the disciples? Is that just one person's job, two people's job? Right? We make disciples. Do you have a Bible? Do you know how you became a Christian? Should you be able to teach how someone else should be able to become a Christian? Make, right? And making does not stop. Making does not stop at baptism. Somebody read Matthew 28, 18 through 20. Or you can quote it if you have it quoted, memorized. But it's always good to read it. Matthew 28, 18 through 20. All at once. Anyone want to read it?
I'll read it, I got mine though. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii.
Are you in Matthew 28? Did I say 18? Matthew 28, 18 through 20. 28. I sometimes misspeak. 18 through 20. Okay, a couple things here. First, how do you initially make disciples? By baptizing. Baptism is the process of making a new disciple. Okay? But what is the second step to that? Teaching them to observe all things. Now, all things, a lot of times, is when we start going, all right, let's start teaching. We almost have our own kind of catechism, right? Old Testament, New Testament, right? What are the attributes of God? You think that's what Jesus has in mind when he's saying to teach them to observe all things? I mean, that may be a part of it. But when you read the Gospels, what does it seem as if Jesus' priority was about somebody who wants to be his disciple? What are the all things that they should be observing?
His actions, how he lives, what he's doing.
His actions, how he lives. What's the two greatest commandments? Love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the law hangs from those two commandments, right? If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Well, in that same chapter, what is he talking about? His commandments are to love one another, right? And so the observing all things is to become more like Jesus. So our process of discipleship is invite, to make, I would say by more than just making initially, but transforming. That's why we have Bible class. I mean, what's the purpose of Bible class? Isn't it for us to learn? All right, that's why, I try to bring up from time to time, if you guys aren't taking this anywhere outside of this 45-minute class, I'm wasting my time and you're wasting yours, right? We're really wasting each other's time. Because in 3 or 4 days, how much of this are you going to remember if you don't think about it or talk about it the next day? Without repetition, what do you do with information that comes in? It's gone. Larry? Be imitators of me as I have Christ. And I want to talk about that phrase just for a second, and then I'll get to you. There's a cool thing that's missing, or there's some inferences in that phrase. Imitate me as I what? Imitate Christ. Is Paul considering himself a perfect disciple? No. Ways in which I'm imitating Christ, which means there are areas in Paul's life where he's not holding up to that standard, and he only wants people to follow the example when it is a Christ-like example. Okay? And so I think that's an interesting part of discipleship process, because you want to know what our young kids, at least I did as a young kid, needed to know? There were people that I looked up to in the church, and as I got older and I entered into men's business meetings, you know what I realized about the people that I looked up to? They weren't as Christ-like as I thought they were. They were on Sunday morning, because Sunday morning, everybody's on the show. Everybody's got, everybody's on, right? Everybody's on Sunday morning. And even sometimes you're not, because you've come in with a bad day or, whatever it is. But you're seeing people's best. And it was a real shocker to me when I walked in and I watched two men who I looked up to literally tear each other's throat out in a meeting over something that I believe was pretty trivial. But everybody's got their opinions, and what happens when you stomp on someone's opinion? Gets hurt. So we need to realize, as we're discipling people, what are we still working on ourselves? Right? You don't need to wait until you are a perfect disciple before you begin discipling. A lot of times when you will say, hey, let's disciple each other, let's work on each other, you grow together. Right? There are things that Paul needed Timothy for, and there are things that Timothy needed Paul for. And Paul writes that in 1 Thessalonians 2. Steve? He's going to grab a mic.
I was going to mention that you asked the question about discipleship of our children back over the weekend.
Yep.
And then you asked earlier about parenting and whatnot. But this falls in line. If you look, I'll put this up really fast. There's a framework, and the framework is in Acts chapter 2. And there are 5 key elements that have been laid out for us at the end of Acts chapter 2 that tells us specifically how to build the church.
Yep.
And if you do those things at home, you'll be successful. If you do those things at church, you'll be successful. Like the youth group, if you do teaching, because here in, and I'll just read it really fast. So
42.
Acts chapter 2, verse 42. Now, this is after somebody's baptized, right? 3,000. They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, number 1, and fellowship, 2, and to breaking of bread and to prayer, 3. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe, and many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles, and all those who had believed were together and had all things in common, and they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all as anyone might have need. And that's service. So you have teaching, fellowship, prayer, and they were also praising. So you have 5 key elements that build the church, and it says at the end, and there were souls added to the church daily. And if we did those things at home and we do those same things here, you will build a discipleship that will be successful.
Yep. And we're going to be talking about that in a couple weeks. So keep that. And all these kind of things we're going to be kind of bringing up again. Once again, this is kind of our introduction. I do want to read real quick. Let's go to 2 Timothy. And I'm going to read a couple passages out of 2 Timothy. I would call for volunteers, but just for sake of time, just follow along with me. So start in chapter 1. Look at verse 5. I am reminded, this is Paul talking to Timothy, I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well. That's the Deuteronomy 6 principle, by the way. Deuteronomy 6 is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, right? And if you do these and you keep all of the commandments of God, you will not only save yourself, but your children and your grandchildren. And this is passed on when each generation takes that seriously, right? It couldn't have just been the grandmother, skip a generation, and then get down to the grandchild. A lot of times that fails. It's got to be passed on, right? And then look over at 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2, and this is what Paul will tell. I'll read 1 and 2. You then, my child, be strengthened by the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others as well. So Paul is saying, I've taught you, Timothy, go teach others who can then teach others. And it continues to spread out. And if everybody would take that mission, right? Somebody taught me, so I'm going to teach them, but I'm going to teach them so they can teach. Teaching someone how to teach is difficult, but it's necessary. We need to be able to share the tools of how to communicate the gospel with the next generation. And then over in 2 Timothy chapter 3, look at verse 14. But as for you, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. Now, by the way, who did he learn those sacred writings from? We saw earlier. All right, so it wasn't just example. It wasn't just the example of a sincere faith. It was also through teaching, right? And through this teaching, all Scripture is inspired by God. That's where we get that. Profitable for teaching. So what do you do with that Word of God? You teach, you reprove, you correct, for training in righteousness. Our homes are the first place where disciples are trained. And if it's not happening at home, you've made the church's job that much harder. And you can't blame Israel. You can't blame Daniel. You can't blame the elders if it's not going on at home and say, you know what, you've let my kid fail. And I'll turn around and say, what are you doing? What are you doing at home? What's your process of discipleship? Because that's where it starts. Okay? We can get through everything, but what I really want you guys to do is the end of this is to fill out the last two parts. Come next week ready to discuss the last two sections. One, what stops people from becoming a true disciple? There's a couple verses to read and come up with two things each. Your own experience. And then finally, some discussion questions. What are some ways you want to become a better disciple? We'll talk about next week. What are you hoping to get out of this class? List two people in your life who you think could help you in your journey. And list two people you want to help in your own journey. Okay? So this is getting us to think and be aware. Come next week ready to discuss. Thank you.